The first time silence cost me something, it was so small I almost didn't notice. A favor left unreturned, a credit taken by someone else, a lie I pretended not to hear because it was easier to keep the peace. It starts like that. Small. A missed chance to defend yourself. A truth swallowed whole because you don't want to sound bitter or difficult. You tell yourself it's maturity. You tell yourself it's strategy. You tell yourself you're above it. But silence is never neutral. It grows teeth. At first, mine were dull. I thought silence made me wise. That restraint meant control. But over time, it started chewing through me from the inside. It began in the office, under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects over rotting fruit. Deadlines piled up like unspoken words. My ideas, my reports, my late nights, all spoken by other mouths. Names I respected, people I trusted. Every time they presented my work as theirs, I said nothing. I smiled. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit, that the truth always finds its way home. But the truth doesn't walk by itself. You have to carry it. And I was too tired to lift anything anymore. One afternoon, during a meeting that smelled like burnt coffee and cold ambition, I watched my manager flip through slides I'd made. The color schemes, the copy, the logic, every word mine. He didn't even blink when someone praised his innovation. I waited for him to glance my way, maybe nod, maybe offer me a sliver of acknowledgement. He didn't. That's when I felt it. The small tear in my chest, like fabric ripping under strain, a quiet sound that no one else could hear. When the meeting ended, I gathered my notes, nodded like everything was fine, and walked to the restroom. I locked myself inside a stall and just stared at the door. The silence there was heavy, not peaceful, not comforting, heavy, like it had weight, like it was sitting on my shoulders and breathing down my neck. I remember thinking, this is what erasure feels like, not anger, not sadness, just the numb space where your voice should be. That night, I walked home through the rain. The city looked beautiful and cruel, reflections of streetlights stretching across puddles like lies trying to look honest. I watched strangers rush past me, phones in hand, umbrellas tilted, all of them living loud lives while I drowned in quiet. When I got home, I opened my laptop to finish another report, another invisible effort for someone else's glory. But my hands wouldn't move. They just hovered over the keyboard like they were waiting for permission. That's when the thought hit me, sharp and sudden. Maybe silence isn't peace. Maybe it's surrender. But I still didn't speak. I told myself timing was everything, that one day I'd have power, that the moment would come when truth would matter. Weeks passed, the project stacked up, so did the resentment. I started measuring my worth in the weight of unspoken things, or how many times I bit my tongue, how many hours I stayed late, how many nights I replayed conversations that never happened. People called me calm, collected, dependable. They had no idea calm is just a prettier word for broken. One evening, after another long day of watching someone else shine under my light, I stopped by a small diner, the kind that still smelled like old coffee and grease no matter how much air freshener they sprayed. The waitress smiled at me, called me hon, and slid a cup of black coffee my way. I didn't even like black coffee, but I drank it anyway, because that's what I did. Swallowed things that didn't belong to me. At the counter, an old man sat reading a newspaper. His voice cracked when he spoke to the waitress. "You ever notice," he said, "how the quiet ones are always the ones people forget first?" She laughed softly. "Guess that's the cost of being peaceful." He shook his head. "No, that's the cost of being afraid." The words hit me harder than they should have. Maybe because they were true. I finished my coffee, left a tip, and walked out into the night. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still glistened, catching pieces of light from passing cars. Everything looked so temporary. When I got home, I opened my journal, the one I hadn't written in for months, and wrote a single sentence. Silence is expensive. It takes pieces of you every time you use it. The next morning I came into work early. I sat at my desk, staring at my reflection in the black screen of my monitor. My eyes looked tired, my face calm, a perfect disguise. Then I heard voices down the hall. My team lead and another colleague, laughing. My name came up, or no, followed by silence, then laughter again. I felt that same weight return pressing into my chest, but this time something else came with it. A pulse, a flicker of something that felt like defiance. I walked into the meeting room. They both stopped talking, faces rearranging into polite smiles. "Morning," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. They nodded. My team lead held up a printout. We were just discussing the final draft of my proposal. I smiled. "Oh?" Then I reached into my bag and pulled out my notebook. The one with every draft, every timestamp, every version written in my handwriting. I placed it on the table. "You mean this proposal?" He froze. My colleague shifted awkwardly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just looked him in the eye. For the first time, my silence wasn't submission. It was evidence. The room went cold. And for a moment I thought, maybe this is what taking your voice back feels like. But it wasn't victory. Not yet. Because taking your voice back means being ready for what happens after, and I wasn't, not yet. That afternoon, HR called me in. They said there had been concerns about my attitude. I sat there listening to corporate words about teamwork and communication and professionalisms and all the polite ways people say, "Stay quiet." When I walked out, I wasn't angry, just tired, because I realized silence doesn't just protect other people, it imprisons you. That night, I didn't go home. I walked miles through the city, past closed stores and flickering streetlights, past everything I thought I wanted, and somewhere between one breath and the next, I made a decision. I wouldn't let my voice rot inside me anymore, even if it cost me everything. That's where the story really begins, because silence doesn't end with a whisper, it ends with a reckoning. The day after HR dressed their warning in nice words, I woke up to a calendar invite I hadn't accepted. Quick sync, 9 all X's AM. No subject, no agenda, no one on the invite but me and the manager who'd learned to speak my ideas with his own mouth. The subject line was clean, the way a knife is clean. I got there early. Sat in the glass room with the city blinking behind him, 1,000 windows watching the performance. He walked in late, smiling like he'd done me a favor by arriving. He took the seat at the head of the table out of habit. He didn't notice I'd chosen the chair directly across, where his reflection doubled in the glass behind him. One man, two silhouettes, one truth, two stories. "You caused some confusion yesterday," he said, voice easy, hands folded like a prayer he didn't mean. I wanted to align. I didn't interrupt. Silence can be a weapon when you hold it by the handle instead of the blade. He leaned forward, lowered his voice like he was letting me in on a secret. "I need you to be a team player. You're valuable. But we can't have possessiveness. The company needs flexibility, shared ownership." Shared ownership. That's what thieves call it when they're telling you to leave the window unlocked. I let him talk until he started repeating himself. People do that when they feel you slipping away. They loop familiar lines like a lullaby to keep you asleep. When he paused to breathe, I slid a paper across the table. A timeline, dates, file hashes, emails, the log from the project management tool, edits tracked with my user ID. I'd spent the night gathering the truth into something that couldn't be ignored. Not a scream, not a plea, a record. He didn't touch the page. He laughed, small and airy. "This is not necessary." "It isn't," I said. My voice didn't tremble. "I'm documenting, so no one forgets." His smile cracked. Only a hairline fracture, but I saw it. "Look," he said, "we both know how these things work. The team contributes, leadership synthesizes. That's the job." I met his eyes. "You called it your proposal." He blinked. "It is my proposal. You just said it was shared." He chose the wrong moment to get angry. I'm not going to debate semantics. I picked up the paper and stood. He stood too, quick, like he was afraid I'd walk away with it. Maybe he'd forgotten you can't confiscate what someone remembers. I'll be sending this to HR, I said, and to the clients who should know who they're paying for what. That made him cold. The smile snapped off. If you go around me, you won't like where this ends. I don't like where it's been. He stepped closer. The light from the window carved shadows into the lines around his mouth. You think you're the first person who tried to start a fire they couldn't control? I gave a small nod. Probably not. Then I left. Not dramatic, not rushed, just done. The kind of walking that says the door is now a border and I'm across it. By 11, the emails began, not from HR, from people who forgot to check who was CC'd before they replied all. Little notes of panic in corporate dialect, concerned about tone, risk, optics. One message said, "Can we contain this?" Another said, "What's their end game?" Not my, their. I was already plural, a problem, a rumor, a cautionary tale. At lunch, I ate alone by the window. Tomato soup that tasted like a memory. Outside, the city breathed fog into the glass. I watched a pigeon hop along a ledge like it owned the whole building and realized ownership isn't who pays for things. It's who won't give them back. At 2, HR called me in again, 2 of them this time. The room smelled like printer toner and sanitized responsibility. "We're here to help," the woman said. "We want to ensure you feel heard." I placed the timeline on the table. "Hear this?" They skimmed it, eyes moving the way people do when they're already writing a response in their heads. The man asked if I had considered how my approach might impact team cohesion. The woman asked how she could support my emotional safety. "I don't want emotional safety," I said. "I want professional honesty." They asked me to be patient. They said they would look into it. I asked for a written acknowledgement. They hesitated just long enough to tell me everything. When I walked out, my manager was waiting in the hall. He clapped my shoulder the way people clap closed a coffin. "You made this messy," he said under his breath. "Now we clean it up." I brushed his hand away. Not hard. Enough. He called after me. "You're overestimating what anyone will do for you." I didn't turn around. I stopped asking anyone to do anything for me. The next day, things escalated the way quiet earthquakes do. Nothing at first, then plates fall off shelves, meetings I wasn't invited to, files I suddenly didn't have permission to open, a new project assigned to me with an impossible deadline and vague goals, a trap built from benevolent words. I worked anyway, but I changed the way I worked. I saved everything somewhere they couldn't reach. I wrote in sentences that couldn't be broken and reassembled against me. I CC'd legal on a simple thank you and watched the room adjust its posture. On the 3rd day, a woman from another department stopped me by the elevator. She wore a pin with a chip in the enamel, some charity, some cause. "I saw your email," she said quietly, like the hallway had ears. "Good for you." "Is it?" "For now." She pressed the button. "The first time you speak up, they study you. The second time, they test you. The third time, they teach you a lesson." "What's the lesson?" "That the cost of telling the truth is isolation." The doors opened. She didn't get on. "Call me if you need someone to witness." Then she walked away. Witness, not ally, not savior. Someone to hold the flashlight while you show the room what was always there. By the end of the week, I understood the shape of what I'd started. External conflict isn't a single blow. It's 1,000 small cuts made by hands you once shook. The first cut was reputation. Emails that used to begin with my name now began with team. Meetings that used to depend on my presence suddenly didn't need me after all. A sentence I wrote appeared in a deck with the wording rearranged just enough to pass a lazy eye. I learned what it means to be erased in real time. The second cut was time, a rush of new tasks with unclear ownership. On Monday, my manager gave me a priority marked hot. On Tuesday, he asked why I'd ignored the other priority marked hotter. On Wednesday, he wondered why my attitude had become rigid. Rigidity, another word used by people who want you to bend until you break. The third cut was isolation. The lunch table went quiet when I sat down. Slack threads slowed when I joined. Someone I liked stopped writing me emojis. Tiny things, easy to deny. Designed to make you look paranoid when you notice. I noticed. So I did something small and unforgivable. I told the truth out loud in a room where people measure their words the way jewelers measure stones. We were in the Thursday stand-up. He was talking. He held the floor like a leash. He said the client loved his framing on the campaign. He said he'd deliver the revised strategy by Friday. Which version? I asked, voice steady. The revision that corrects the conversion funnel you misrepresented, or the revision that includes the audience segmentation you objected to until the client liked it? His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at me the way a person looks at a fuse they didn't realize was burning. What are you implying? He said, that your revision can't exist until I finish the work you'll rename. The table went motionless. Time can kneel when it wants to. He tried to laugh. We're a team. I agree, I said, which is why I'll be adding authorship to the deliverable and pushing it to the client directly for clarity, with logs. There it was. Not a threat. A boundary. Boundaries sound like threats to people who benefit from you having none. After the meeting, he pulled me into an empty office. He shut the door, then turned slowly like he was giving the room time to commit my face to memory. You think you win just because you make noise? He asked. I think I stopped losing because I stopped disappearing. He stepped close. Too close. You don't understand how this world works. Maybe I do, I said. Maybe that's why I'm done letting it work on me. He stared at me like he was deciding if I was worth the fight. I made the decision for him. Send whatever memo you want, I said. Draft whatever narrative comforts you. But the next time my work appears under your name, it won't be an HR conversation. It'll be a public record. His jaw tightened. He had nice teeth. I thought about wolves. Who's going to believe you, he whispered. Anyone who needs what I have. I tapped the notebook I always carried now. Proof, patience, and nothing left to lose. He laughed once, sharp as a snapped bone. Everyone has something left to lose. Not after silence takes its share. I walked out and left him with his reflection. By Friday, the noise rose. Not mine, theirs. The scramble you hear when people start to realize the room isn't as soundproof as they hoped. My name got attached to words like difficult and intense. Old stories were dusted off and rewritten with new morals. Someone told someone that once I'd failed to respond to an email within the hour. Someone else remembered I'd raised a concern about scope and framed it as negativity. The simplest way to break a mirror is to distract the eyes. I kept working. At 9 that night, when most floors were dark, the client replied to our shared thread. They wanted to schedule a call with me. Not with the team, with me. They'd seen the log, the drafts, the timestamps I'd attached to the deliverables. They had questions. He forwarded me the invite with a single line. We'll attend together. I replied with 3 words, per their request. He didn't answer. At midnight, I walked out into a city shivering under the weight of its own lights. A bus hissed to a stop, then groaned away feeling older than it was. On the corner, a woman argued quietly into her phone, her hand over her mouth like she was holding the words in even as she let them go. Across the street, a man practiced guitar without a case open for coins. He wasn't playing for money. He was playing because sometimes the body has to make noise to prove it's alive. I took the long way home. I counted the locks on the doors I passed. I tried to remember the last time I asked for anything without apologizing. In my apartment, I turned on the lamp and nothing else. The room held me like a secret it was tired of keeping. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and opened the journal. I wrote what I knew now. Silence is a contract. You sign it with your grit and your grace and your no worries. You sign it with your late nights and your archived drafts and your habit of making other people comfortable before you decide if you are, and every signature costs a piece of you you will never see again. The external conflict wasn't him. It wasn't HR. It wasn't the team. It was the system that taught them my quiet was theirs to spend, and it was me who taught them how to spend it. At 2 a.m, my phone lit up. A message from an unknown number. "Be careful," it said. "He's done this before." I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. I typed back one word. "Who?" The answer took a minute. "Someone who paid for silence and wants a refund." We scheduled the client call for Monday morning. All weekend I prepared. Not with anger, with facts. Receipts are the calmest kind of storm. Monday came like a verdict. I wore black without thinking about what it meant. I took the elevator with people who pretended not to see me. I walked into the conference room and arranged my notes. He arrived last, practiced smile back in place, wearing a tie that looked expensive and somehow cheap. The client joined. A woman with a voice built for cutting noise. A man who didn't waste words. They asked questions, real ones, sharp ones, the kind that don't fear answers. I answered. I explained the choices. I owned the mistakes. I didn't use "we" when I was true. He tried to jump in twice and landed on silence because the client didn't invite him to talk. I didn't look at him. I looked at the work. When it ended, the woman said, "Thank you for the clarity." She paused. "And for the courage?" After the call, he closed the door and leaned against it like he could keep the world out if he pushed hard enough. "You think that was smart?" he said. "I think it was honest." "You'll regret this." "Probably," I said. "Regret is cheaper than silence." He stared at me, calculating. Then he changed tactics the way chameleons change walls. "Listen," he said gently. "We got off on the wrong foot. I'm under pressure. I should have given you more credit. I'll fix it. I'll add your name to the deck. We'll co-present next time. That's fair, right?" It almost sounded like a win. It almost sounded like progress. But it wasn't. It was a bargain offered when power feels the temperature drop. "I'm not asking for credit," I said. "I'm asserting authorship. There's a difference. Credit can be taken back. Authorship is the record." He dropped the gentleness. "You don't want to make an enemy of me." I met his eyes. "I'm not making enemies. I'm ending. Permissions." He huffed. Dismissive, the sound of a man who believed endings were his to give. The next hour, HR called me in again. This time, legal joined. A new person sat at the end of the table, a quiet man with a patient mouth. The woman from HR wore concern like a scarf. "We've received additional feedback about your behavior," she said, carefully neutral. "There's worry that your recent communications have created a hostile environment." "Truth feels hostile when you profit from confusion," I said. The quiet man finally spoke. "Let's separate feelings from facts. We're looking at ownership questions, process breakdowns, and communication tone. We'll investigate. In the meantime, we need to ensure operational continuity." Operational continuity. A nice way to say, go sit in the corner while we decide if you belong in this room. "What does that mean?" I asked. It means, HR said, "we'd like you to step back from client-facing conversations for now." Because I told the client the truth. Because we need time. Time to do what? Make a softer version of what happened? She sighed, and for a moment I saw the person under the role. Tired, human, afraid like everyone else. Time to protect everyone from escalation. I thought about that word, escalation, as if honesty was a fire you start instead of a fire you point at. "I won't step back," I said, "but I'll document." The quiet man nodded like he expected that. "Then document well." He slid a thin folder toward me. "And keep talking to us instead of the hallway." I left with the folder. I left with my notebook. I left with a feeling I didn't have a word for yet, a feeling that sounded like a door clicking shut behind the part of me that stayed small to fit through other people's frames. That afternoon, I got an email from the woman with the chipped pin. Subject, witness, body. 2 years ago, same pattern, different person. If you want details, coffee at 4, off-site. We met at a small cafe that steamed its windows into privacy. She arrived with a binder that looked ordinary until you opened it. Statements, copies of emails, notes from conversations where nothing important was officially said. He didn't do it alone, she said. People like him never do. They build a little economy of silence. You hire the right kinds of grateful. You borrow their voices. You pay them in praise and proximity and the promise of later. You push out anyone who won't play. The machine hums. It looks like success from the street. Why didn't you speak up then? I asked gently. I did, she said, to the wrong ears. I made it about my pain. They made it about my professionalism. I left. The story stayed. She slid the binder toward me. You won't defeat him with outrage. You defeat him with architecture. Build a structure he can't decorate. I carried the binder back through the evening like it was heavier than paper. In the lobby, I ran into him. He saw the binder. He looked at my face. Something cautious flickered behind his eyes. What is that? He asked. History, I said. He smiled, but it was all gums. Careful with history. It's written by survivors. I plan on surviving, I said. I worked late. At midnight, I sent a memo to HR, legal, and the client, a clear outline of authorship, process, deliverables, and the specific moments where ownership blurred. I avoided adjectives the way people avoid landmines. I attached the logs. I signed my name the way I meant to keep it. Then I shut my laptop and said the part out loud I hadn't yet admitted to myself. I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to stop losing. I slept with the light on. The next morning, I arrived to an inbox full of unclean peace. Apologies that didn't admit fault, invitations to align, a message from leadership asking me to take this offline. Offline is where truth goes to drown. I didn't reply. Not yet. I headed to the stairwell instead. I took it up to the roof. The city met me with wind that smelled like metal and rain that hadn't begun falling yet. I stood at the ledge and looked at all the windows, all the rooms, all the people making deals with their silence. Then I did something small and irreversible. I called my mother. We don't talk much, not for any dramatic reason, just the quiet drift that happens when years stack up and everyone tells themselves they'll call tomorrow. She answered on the third ring, voice bright and a little surprised. I told her things I should have told myself sooner. That I'd been disappearing and I was done. That I was tired of being useful to people who bent my usefulness into their own mirrors. That the cost of silence is not just your dignity. It's your life, paid in daily installments. She listened, the way only someone who held your first noise can listen. Then she said, I'm proud of you. She didn't ask for details. She didn't ask for names. She only said, the truth wears heavy boots at first, but it walks you out of rooms you were never meant to die in. When I hung up, the wind lifted the corners of my jacket like applause. I went back downstairs. I wrote one email. Not angry, not long. It said, moving forward, I will be attaching my authorship to all deliverables. Any presentation of my work without attribution will be considered a breach of professional ethics and escalated to appropriate channels. Clarity is kindness. Thank you. I sent it to everyone who needed to know and a few who needed to witness. Then I opened the next file and kept working. External conflict isn't a storm you outrun. It's rain you learn to walk through without giving anyone your umbrella. Late afternoon, the client called again. They wanted me on the next presentation by name. They used it twice, as if to prove it was mine. When we hung up, he leaned in my doorway. He had a new smile on, contrition flavored with strategy. I guess they like you, he said. I guess they like results. He studied me. You're different. I'm the samey, I said. I just stopped paying for your comfort with my silence. He was quiet, not the kind I used to give him. The kind that belongs to people who realize a door has locked and they're on the wrong side. That night, I walked home in the first rain. Thin drops, persistent, the kind that gets inside collars and around edges. I didn't rush. I let it find me. I let it wash some of the day off my skin. In my apartment, I left the window open a crack and let the city breathe into the room. I wrote 3 words at the top of a blank page. The reckoning begins. Then I wrote a 4th word, small and certain, the one that would carry me through the battles I could already hear moving in the walls. Louder. The body always breaks before the voice does. Mine started with small betrayals and tremor in my hands when I typed, a jaw that clenched even in sleep. Every night I dreamed of conversations that never happened and woke tasting the words I'd swallowed the day before. The week after the client call, the office turned colder. Not in temperature of souls. People still smiled, but only with the top halves of their faces. My name disappeared from schedules, from meeting invites, from the low-hum gossip that runs a workplace like blood. It was like watching yourself fade from a photograph 1 pixel at a time. Silence followed me down hallways, into elevators, across sidewalks. It had shape now. Weight. A thick fog that filled the spaces between what I said and what people heard. I stopped checking messages. Each notification felt like a verdict. Sleep became negotiation. Half dreams, half bargaining sessions with ghosts of decisions already made. In the mornings, I sat at my desk and stared at the login screen, knowing that inside it was the same world that had decided my truth was inconvenient. They called it professionalism. I called it exile. The woman with the chipped pin still sent small notes, no subject lines, just a dot or a blank page, little proofs that someone remembered I existed, but even those became less frequent. Witnesses tire too. One night the building emptied early for a company event I hadn't been invited to. From the window I saw them gathering across the street, laughter in coats, hands holding glasses that caught the light. From that distance, betrayal looked beautiful. I stayed to finish a report no one would read. When I finally stood to leave, the power flickered. For a second, the monitor went black and reflected my face back at me. I almost didn't recognize it. There was stillness in it. Not calm, but vacancy. Outside, the air bit hard. I walked aimlessly until I ended, up by the river. Water has a way of listening without pity. I leaned on the railing and asked the dark what the point of being right was if it left you alone. The dark didn't answer, but the wind did. A hollow sound like laughter stripped of warmth. Days blurred. HR postponed their investigation. My manager vanished into meetings that apparently lasted forever. When he did pass me in the hall, he looked through me the way people look through glass to see their own reflection. Once, I caught my name on his lips in a conversation that stopped when I entered the room. The laughter that followed was too loud to be casual. I started coming in later, leaving earlier. No one noticed. Silence had done its job. At home, dishes piled, laundry sat cold. I told myself I was conserving energy, but the truth was simpler: inertia. I moved only when necessary, spoke only when forced, lived only enough to keep existing from turning into dying. The mind plays tricks in long quiets. It edits memories, softens the edges of wrongs you endured until you wonder if maybe they weren't that sharp after all. Maybe you overreacted. Maybe you should have smiled longer, waited more patiently, trusted harder. The brain is loyal to pain when it doesn't know what else to serve. I tried to distract myself, podcasts, books, endless scrolling. Every story felt like someone else's courage. Every motivational line sounded like a lie whispered through a filter. On Friday night, I went to the same diner as before. Different waitress this time, younger, eyes full of the optimism that's easiest before the world notices you. She asked if I wanted my usual. I said yes, though I didn't remember choosing one. The coffee was bitter. The booth creaked when I shifted. Behind me, 2 co-workers sat laughing, their voices rising over the jukebox. My name again. Soft, then louder, then followed by a punchline I couldn't hear. I didn't turn around. I just listened until my pulse drowned them out. That was the moment I realized how much energy silence requires. To hold still when everything in you wants to shout. to keep your hands steady while your soul paces the room. It's exhausting to disappear. I went home and didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the floor, back against the couch, same position as weeks ago. The city outside moved like a slow heartbeat. I tried to count how many times I'd chosen quiet over honesty. Lost track after 10. The phone buzzed once, a message from the chipped pin woman. Still with you. I typed back. For how long? Deleted it. Typed again. Thank you. Sent. The screen glow painted the walls in blue. Blue like a bruise. Blue like forgiveness that hasn't arrived. I dreamed that night of standing in an empty boardroom. All the chairs faced away from me. Every time I tried to speak, the room filled with static. Then I woke, with the sound still in my ears, not quite noise, not quite silence, something between. Monday morning came with gray light and the smell of rain through cracked windows. At work, my access badge failed. The guard looked apologetic as he waved me through manually. System glitch, he said. Maybe. At my desk, the plant someone once gave me had died. No one watered it, no one noticed. That felt fair. At noon, an email arrived from HR. We appreciate your cooperation. Pending further review, please refrain from external communications regarding ongoing matters. In other words, be quiet again. I closed the laptop. My reflection stared back from the dark screen, tired and strangely calm. Maybe this was what breaking looked like. Not noise, not chaos, just the quiet acceptance that no one is coming to fix it. That evening I walked until my legs ached, past neon signs buzzing like trapped insects, past couples arguing softly, past a man selling umbrellas under a dry sky. The world kept talking. I kept listening. At the bridge I stopped. Below, the river moved with its own slow confidence. I leaned on the railing and whispered a confession only the water could hear. I'm scared I was wrong. About everything. The current didn't judge. It just carried the sound away piece by piece until even I couldn't recognize it. When I turned to leave, the woman with the chipped pin was there. She must have followed the same instinct to find motion when stillness hurts. She said nothing, just stood beside me. After a while, she asked, "Do you ever think about quitting?" "All the time." "Then why don't you?" "Because if I leave now, silence wins again." She nodded. The wind took her hair across her face. She didn't move it. "Just remember," she said, "winning and surviving aren't always the same thing." We stood until the lights on the water blurred into one long smear of gold. Then she walked away first. I stayed until the cold reached my bones. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her words loop like a song with no chorus. Winning and surviving. Two ends of the same rope pulling against each other. Sometime after 3, I opened my journal. The pages smelled like dust and ink and failure. I wrote, "Silence doesn't punish you all at once. It takes interest. Every time you swallow a truth, you owe it more of yourself." I stopped there. Couldn't think past the next line. So I let the pen fall and stared at the ceiling until morning. When I arrived at work, my computer background had changed. Company standard, blue gradient, white logo. My folder labeled Projects 2025 was gone. Archived maybe, erased maybe. No one said a word. Around noon, I stepped into the bathroom just to breathe. The fluorescent lights hummed. The mirror hummed back. I watched myself wash my hands even though they were already clean. The sound of water hitting porcelain was the loudest thing in the world. Someone came in footsteps I recognized. He stopped at the next sink. "HR's closing the file," he said, not looking up. "They didn't find evidence." I dried my hands slowly. "They didn't look." He shrugged. "You could still come back from this if you let it go." "Let what go?" "The noise." He left before I could answer. The door closed with a sigh. In the mirror, I saw my mouth move but heard nothing. For a second, I wondered if I'd actually lost my voice. The afternoon passed in fragments. A call, a note, a polite question from a coworker who didn't want the answer. The clock hands dragged themselves across the face like they were tired too. At 6, the lights dimmed automatically. Everyone gone again. I stayed. Not to work. To listen. Offices have their own language after hours, the hum of machines cooling, the sigh of vents, the far-off click of an elevator you didn't call. It sounded like relief. I thought about packing up, about walking out and never coming back. But leaving without closure felt like another kind of silence, and I was tired of paying. So I sat there until the sky turned from gray to ink, and the city lit itself like a confession. Somewhere in that half-dark, I realized how small I'd become, how carefully I'd folded myself to fit inside other people's comfort, how long I'd mistaken endurance for strength. And in that recognition was something dangerous. Not hope yet, but its outline, a shape forming behind the curtain. I exhaled long and slow and said to the empty room, I can't keep doing this. The words didn't echo. They absorbed into the walls, into the carpet, into me. They stayed. When I finally stood, my knees cracked. The air felt heavier, but also real. I gathered my things, notebook, pen, the dead plant, a relic of something that once tried to live here. I placed it gently in the trash. On the way out, I stopped at the glass door. My reflection waited on the other side, blurred by fingerprints. I touched the surface, cold, solid, still here. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped in. Pressed L. As the doors closed, the building hummed around me, the sound of all the words still trapped inside its walls. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. I just listened to it breathe. And somewhere between the lobby and the street, something inside me cracked, not breaking down, but breaking open. Not yet light, but no longer blind. The descent stopped. The doors slid apart, and the story paused there, balanced between floors, waiting for the first movement of the person I was about to become. When you've been quiet long enough, noise feels dangerous. The first sound that broke my new silence wasn't a voice or a word. It was the kettle. That small, startled cry it makes when the water reaches a boil. I watched the steam twist upward like something trying to leave its body. And for the first time in months, I didn't flinch at it. I poured the water into a mug, sat by the window, and realized I had no idea what day it was. The sky was a thin gray. Somewhere below, the city was waking up, stretching, honking, rushing. I wasn't part of it, not yet. But I was still here, and that counted for something. The mind keeps running even after the race ends. Mine replayed every meeting, every look, every almost word I'd swallowed. It was a loop I couldn't stop. So I started writing it instead, not for proof this time, not for anyone to read, just to get it out of me. At first, the sentences came out stiff like soldiers afraid to disobey. Then they softened. Then they started to breathe. By the third page, I wasn't writing about them anymore. I was writing about me. I wrote about the sound the rain made on the office windows, about the smell of toner, about the way silence had trained me to watch everyone else's mouth move and call it communication, about how power looks polite until it realizes you've stopped bowing. Somewhere between one sentence and the next, I remembered what my voice sounded like when it wasn't apologizing. The next morning, I walked without headphones. Every sound felt raw and real. Engines, crosswalks, strangers coughing, wind scraping against glass. It all pressed against me like proof that life was still going on, even if mine had slowed. I found a small cafe near the river. No neon, no music, just the hiss of milk and the clatter of dishes. The barista had tattoos of constellations down her arm. When she asked for my order, I hesitated, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to say it clearly. Black, I said, then added, please. A simple thing, but it felt like an incantation. I took the cup to a corner seat. Steam fogged my glasses. I sipped, burned my tongue, laughed quietly. It was ridiculous how alive pain could make you feel when it wasn't emotional. On the wall above me, someone had scribbled a line in pencil. "The truth will set you free, but first it will make you lonely." I traced the words with my eyes until they blurred. Lonely, yes, but free, maybe a little. Days stretched without structure. No meetings, no directives, no performance reviews to grade my worth. At first it felt like drowning in air. Then it started to feel like breathing. I cleaned my apartment, not out of duty, but to prove I could create order that didn't hurt. I washed the coffee mugs stacked like monuments to exhaustion. I threw out papers I'd kept for no reason except fear of forgetting. Every small act felt like a conversation with the part of me I'd ignored. I didn't call it healing. Healing implies a return. I wasn't going back. I was building something that hadn't existed before. At night, I read, not productivity books, not self-help checklists, stories, fiction, poetry, essays from people who had walked through their own silences. One line stuck to me like static. Courage isn't volume, it's persistence. That became my prayer. Every morning I whispered it before I touched the keyboard. Persistence. Even when no one was listening. Weeks passed. The ache in my chest eased, though it left a scar I could feel when I breathed too deeply. Emails from work slowed to none. I expected fear to follow, but what came instead was space. I started writing again. Not reports, not memos, stories, fragments of what I'd lived. A character who stayed quiet too long, another who burned bridges and learned to swim in the smoke. I didn't know if they were me or not. Maybe both. Some nights the loneliness came back hard. It sat across from me at the kitchen table and waited for conversation. I let it stay. I didn't chase it away with screens or noise. I just sat with it until it turned into something gentler. Solitude. There's a difference. Loneliness blames the world for leaving. Solitude thanks it for the silence. One morning, the woman with the chipped pin called. I hadn't heard from her in weeks. Her voice was warm, cautious. "I left," she said. "Where to?" "Nowhere yet, but it's mine." She laughed softly. "I used your phrase, you know. Clarity is kindness." It felt strange hearing my words survive outside my mouth. We promised to meet soon. We didn't set a date. We didn't need to. After the call, I stared at the sunlight creeping through the blinds. It cut across the floor in clean lines. I realized I hadn't thought about revenge in days. Not because forgiveness had arrived, but because the hunger had gone quiet. Silence, when it's chosen, tastes different. Around that time, I started volunteering at a community library. Nothing dramatic, sorting books, fixing bindings, helping an old man print resumes. But the rhythm of it soothed me. There was a peace in tasks that began and ended without politics. When I locked up at night, the smell of paper and dust clung to my clothes like a childhood memory. One evening, I caught my reflection in the glass door. Same face, new stillness. The tiredness hadn't left, but it had learned its place. I went home and opened the journal again. The early pages were angry, jagged, crowded. The new ones came slower, cleaner. That night I wrote, maybe power isn't the ability to speak over others. Maybe it's the patience to speak to yourself until you believe it. I read it twice. Didn't correct a word. Weeks turned into months. The world didn't apologize. It rarely does. But I started to notice small mercies. A stranger holding a door, the taste of food when I wasn't eating in a rush, the sound of rain that didn't remind me of deadlines. Sometimes I still woke with panic. The phantom feeling of a meeting I'd forgotten, a task left undone. Then I'd remember. There were no meetings anymore, just mornings, just me. The mind, though, loves structure, so I gave it one. Every day at 7, I walked to the river. I watched the water move steady and indifferent. It never held its shape, but it never disappeared. I started to see myself in that. It Not fixed, not lost, just moving. People began to notice the difference. My mother said I sounded taller on the phone. An old friend wrote, "You pause more before you answer now." Maybe that's what growth sounds like. A longer pause between reaction and response. One afternoon I returned to the office building, not to confront anyone, just to see if the ghosts had kept the place warm. The receptionist was new. The plants were fake now. I stood in the lobby and felt nothing. Not anger, not nostalgia, not even fear. Just a kind of neutrality that felt like peace wearing armor. I left without signing in. Outside, the sun hit the windows and turned them to mirrors. For a moment, I saw myself reflected in every pain. Not erased, multiplied. That evening, I met the chipped pin woman at the same cafe by the river. We talked about small things, books, coffee, the sound of trains at night. When we said goodbye, she looked at me carefully. "You sound free," she said. "I'm getting there." "Does it feel the way you expected?" "No," I said, "I'm better. It's quieter." She smiled. "Keep it that way." On the walk home, I thought about everything silence had cost me, and everything it had accidentally given. Space, awareness, the ability to hear myself think. Maybe that was the secret the whole time. The point wasn't to fill the silence, but to own it. That night I lit a candle instead of turning on the lamp. The flame moved the way thought does. Slow, curious, alive. I watched it until wax pooled around its base. The light wasn't bright, but it was enough to see my hands. Steady now. Ready. I closed the journal and whispered, "Thank you." Though I didn't know who to. Maybe to the silence itself for teaching me that sometimes the only way out is through the quiet that terrifies you. Tomorrow I would start something new. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove I still could. A project, a story, maybe a life that didn't depend on being heard by everyone, only by the right ones. I blew out the candle. The darkness that followed wasn't empty anymore. It hummed softly, like a room waiting for music. Morning came like a question I finally knew how to answer. The light through the blinds wasn't gentle. It was deliberate, slicing the room into patterns of gold and shadow. I stood in it and thought, this is what rebuilding looks like. Not loud, not grand, just steady light landing where it never used to reach. The kettle hissed again. That sound had become a ritual, a reminder that heat can serve creation as easily as destruction. I poured the water, opened my notebook, and faced the blank page like an old friend I'd once betrayed. The silence around me wasn't heavy anymore. It was permission. I started writing, not about pain, not directly, about patterns, people, the strange mathematics of endurance. Each sentence felt like breathing through scar tissue. By noon, I had 5 pages of something that wasn't perfect, but it was mine. It hit me then. Maybe the voice I'd been fighting to protect wasn't just meant to defend, it was meant to build. I began to write every day, at first in secret as if speaking too loudly might scare it away again, then gradually publicly, small posts online, fragments about truth and work, and the soft violence of staying silent too long. The responses came slow, then faster. People I didn't know wrote, "This is me." Others whispered, "Thank you for saying it." Each message was a small flame, and I learned how to tend them without burning myself. I didn't write about revenge anymore. I wrote about recovery, the quiet, unmarketable kind that doesn't photograph well. How healing looks like dishes done on time, like walking without a destination, like saying no without apology. It wasn't viral material, but it was real. One afternoon, an email arrived from a college professor who'd read one of my essays. She taught communications at a small community college by the bay. Her message was short. "Would you come talk to my students about finding a voice in corporate systems?" The words made me laugh out loud. Once, the thought of speaking would have paralyzed me. Now, it just made my pulse quicken in a way that felt alive. I said yes. The campus smelled like rain and chalk and youth, something I'd almost forgotten existed. In the classroom, 20 faces waited, curious and restless. When I started talking, my voice trembled, but I kept going. I told them about the illusion of safety that silence sells, about the way truth corrodes quietly until you name it. They listened, not with awe, but with understanding. And when one student asked, "How do you know when it's time to speak?" I said the first honest thing that came to me: when your silence starts sounding like consent. Afterward, the professor thanked me and asked if I'd ever considered writing a book. I said I didn't know where to start. She smiled. "You already have." That night, I walked by the bay. The water caught the streetlights and broke them into fragments that danced like sparks. Fire and water, opposites making peace. I took that image home with me. Writing turned into structure, outlines, chapters, goals. The discipline that once kept me quiet now kept me steady. Each morning I wrote until the sunlight climbed the wall and reached the ceiling. Each night I reread until I could hear my own rhythm in the words. Sometimes fear still visited, the old fear that my story wasn't big enough, that I was still invisible. When it did, I'd light a candle and watch the flame tremble, alive in its smallness. It reminded me that being seen isn't about size, it's about honesty. Months passed. The essays became a manuscript. The manuscript became something close to a book. I didn't know if it would ever be published, but that wasn't the point. The point was that the silence that once consumed me now had form, shape, edges I could trace. Around that time, I got a message from an old coworker. Different tone. He'd left the company too. Said my story had reached him somehow, that it made him rethink how he handled his own people. "I owe you an apology," he wrote. I didn't need it, but I accepted it anyway. Not because I forgave easily, but because carrying resentment felt like dragging a dead language around. Every apology, I realized, is a mirror. You don't have to look, but you should at least know your reflection is still in it. I took a part-time job teaching writing workshops at the library, the same place where I'd once fixed bindings and printed resumes. Now I stood in front of a group, teenagers, retirees, mothers who wrote at night after work, and told them the thing I'd learned the hard way. Don't wait for permission to tell your story. Silence doesn't protect you. It just delays the truth. They nodded. Some wrote it down. One woman cried quietly while pretending to take notes. After class, she handed me a crumpled page that said, "Thank you for reminding me I'm allowed to exist." That night, I walked home under streetlights that flickered like pulse beats. The air smelled of rain again, water and fire, always alternating. I whispered to the city, "We're learning." By winter, the manuscript was done. I titled it "The Cost of Silence," not because it was catchy, but because every chapter was paid for with a version of myself I'd outgrown. When I mailed the proposal to a small independent publisher, my hands shook, not from fear, from reverence. For the first time, I understood what it meant to risk something willingly. Weeks later, they wrote back. They wanted to publish it. The day I signed the contract, I lit 3 candles on my table. The wax dripped slowly, pooling like melted hours. I thought about all the nights I'd spent in that same room, afraid to make a sound. Now even the flame seemed to breathe louder. Publication wasn't fame. It was a door. Through it came invitations to speak, to teach, to write more. Each one terrified me a little less. In one interview, a journalist asked, "Do you ever regret speaking up?" I answered truthfully, "Sometimes, but regret is temporary. Silence is permanent." The quote spread. People began calling me an advocate, a mentor, a survivor. I didn't feel like any of those things. I felt like a person who had finally stopped mistaking quiet for peace. The real reward wasn't recognition. It was connection. The messages from strangers who said my words gave them courage to walk into HR offices, to quit jobs, to start businesses, to tell partners and parents and bosses what had been left unsaid. Every time I read one, I whispered, "Keep talking." Because that's what this had become. Not a rebellion, not revenge, but an echo chamber of honesty. Every voice that rose made the next one easier to hear. One afternoon, the chipped pin woman came to a reading. She sat in the front row, still wearing that same imperfect circle of enamel. Afterward, she hugged me and whispered, "You built the structure." I whispered back, "You lit the match." When I walked outside, dusk had settled over the city. The river reflected orange and violet. For the first time, the skyline didn't look like a wall. It looked like punctuation, an ellipsis, a continuation. I stood there a long while, watching the water take the light apart and put it back together. Everything ended and began in the same motion. And I realized creation was just that, the art of breaking gently. I went home and opened a new notebook. Page 1, blank again. No fear this time, only the hum of possibility. I wrote, "Silence taught me discipline, pain taught me precision, creation taught me freedom." I closed it and smiled. Outside, the city lights flickered like 1,000 small affirmations, each one a reminder. You can't silence light. You can only delay its arrival. The night before the launch, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear this time, but from awareness. Every sound in the apartment felt amplified. The hum of the fridge, the shuffle of pages on the desk, the pulse in my wrist reminding me that I was still here. Tomorrow, the cost of silence would stop being mine alone. I walked to the window. The city below was a constellation of noise and light, alive and indifferent. For years, I'd lived beneath it like a shadow. Now I was part of its glow. At dawn, I made coffee and reread the first chapter. I expected to find mistakes. Instead, I found distance, like reading the story of a stranger I'd finally forgiven. By mid-morning, my inbox filled with messages, reporters, bookstores, invitations. I answered a few, then closed the laptop. The point was never attention. It was proof that silence can be rewritten. That afternoon, I stood before a small stage in a neighborhood library, the same one where I'd taught workshops. Rows of faces waited, some familiar, some new. Among them were students, old co-workers, even the chipped pin woman. The hum of expectation felt like static before a storm. When the moderator introduced me, I stepped up without notes. I took a breath and said, "Once, I thought silence was safety, but safety without self-respect is just captivity with better lighting." A ripple of laughter. Then quiet. The good kind. The listening kind. I talked about fear, about the nights that felt endless, about the small steps that turned into movement, not heroic, just human. When I finished, the room stood in applause that sounded less like noise and more like release. Afterward, people came forward one by one. A man in his 60s said he'd stayed quiet about workplace abuse for 20 years. He was done. A teenager whispered that she wanted to be a writer now. A woman handed me a folded note that simply read, "You gave me back my sound." I walked home in the rain, coat open, pages of the note dissolving slightly in my hand. It didn't matter. The words had already soaked in. The next months moved fast. The book spread further than I imagined. Podcasts, interviews, classrooms. Not bestseller fast, but steady, honest momentum. Each conversation felt like another person pulling their own story into the light. One morning, my phone buzzed with a message I never expected. My old manager. He'd read the book. He wanted to meet. I hesitated for a whole day before agreeing. Closure isn't a gift, it's work. We met in a cafe downtown. He looked smaller somehow. No tie, no armor. He began to speak, but I stopped him. "I'm not here for apologies," I said. "I'm here for clarity." He nodded slowly, said he'd lost more than he gained, said he envied my courage. For the first time, I believed him. When I left, I felt no triumph, just gravity leaving my shoulders. Forgiveness isn't surrender. It's the decision to stop dragging yesterday into tomorrow. That evening, I returned to the river. The water was restless, glittering with city light. In its reflection, fire and water danced again, two forces that had learned to coexist. I tossed a small stone in and watched the ripples spread until they touched the far bank. That's what words do, I thought. They ripple. They reach. Back home, I opened a blank document titled Next Voice. No plan, no deadline, just curiosity. I typed a single line. Every silence hides a seed. Then I smiled because I finally knew how to make things grow. Months later, at a conference, a young woman approached me backstage. She said she'd been fired after speaking up about credit stolen from her. She was scared but grateful. "What should I do now?" she asked. I thought about how every mentor I'd ever wanted was really just a mirror I hadn't learned to look into, so I told her, build. Build something that doesn't depend on their permission. She nodded. Her eyes didn't look afraid anymore. When the lights dimmed, for my final keynote, I stood center stage. Hundreds of people, silent, waiting. I let the quiet stretch until I could feel its heartbeat. Then I said, "Silence once owned me. Now it works for me. I use it to think, to listen, to create." That's the only revenge worth having, becoming so complete that nothing missing can define you. The applause rolled like thunder. I closed my eyes and let it wash through me, not as validation, but as sound, pure, honest sound, proof of life. Later that night, back in my hotel room, I turned off every light except one. The lamp cast a circle of gold on the wall, trembling slightly as if breathing. I whispered into it, "We made it." The light flickered once, as if agreeing. Outside, the city pulsed. Sirens, laughter, footsteps. Inside, there was only calm, the kind that doesn't ask for anything. I thought of everyone who'd ever stayed quiet out of fear, everyone still measuring the cost of speaking. I wanted to tell them what I'd learned. You can rebuild a life from the sound of your own truth. You can start again as many times as it takes. You can be the noise that saves someone else from disappearing. I closed my eyes. Sleep came easily for the first time in years, and somewhere between dreams and dawn, I heard it again. The soft hiss of a kettle, the whisper of light through blinds, the steady rhythm of a voice that had finally found its home. Not silence, not noise, just harmony.